Hey everybody, this is Jeff. If you listen to this show, there is a very, very good chance you are also familiar with the work of my good friend and, decent coworker, Pat Cassels. Pat has been on this show. He was on the summer movie review episode. Obviously, I've worked with him a great deal in the past. And Pat and I like to talk about nerdy stuff and pop culture, not just when we're in front of microphones. It's kind of part of our daily routine. And for the past few months, a big part of that has been one of our favorite shows, Breaking Bad. We talk about this show every Monday after it's aired, unless one of us hasn't seen it, in which case they will immediately tell the other person, I haven't seen Breaking Bad yet, don't tell me anything about it. And at some point, Pat suggested, hey, we should do a podcast about Breaking Bad, which I thought was a great idea, but I was already busy with a few other things. I mean, you know me, I gotta have my Batman Arkham City episode, but I did want to do it. So I said to Pat, how about this? I'll bring all the equipment, you find someone for us to talk to, figure out what we should be talking about, you basically host the episode, I'll record it and post it, and we did that. And here it is. Oh, one more thing. Do not listen if you've never watched Breaking Bad. We're going to talk about everything that's happened on the show from the beginning until the time we recorded this episode, which is right before the season finale of the 4th season. So if you've never watched Breaking Bad, nothing personal, but you probably should just turn around now and not come in here. Everyone else, you're in for a treat. All right, I think that's everything now.
4, 3, 2, 1, Earth below us, drifting, falling, floating, weightless, calling home.
Hi, and welcome to our Breaking Bad podcast. I'm Pat Cassels, sort of, I guess, hijacking your podcast, Jeff. Temporarily,
Just for the day.
just for the day to talk about Breaking Bad. Jeff Rubin is
Hello.
here, and Darren Franich from Entertainment Weekly and EW.com.
Good to be here.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I just think we're all huge fans of Breaking Bad, and Jeff and I certainly like talking about television. We did a similar thing to this with Lost last year.
With Darren, he was here. Darren was here when we talked about Lost this year.
Yeah.
When we were still talking about Lost a year after it ended.
Can't stop talking about it even now.
No, but then, yeah, the week before the finale of Lost, we talked with Chuck Klosterman about it, and it was pretty cool. So here we are talking about Breaking Bad. I will start with a question. How do you guys feel this season has differed from the previous seasons? Because I find Breaking Bad, it's changed a lot. I love all the seasons, but more so than other shows, it feels like a very different show than it was.
It kind of feels like it's gotten, and this is not a bad thing, it's gotten slower this season. I mean, compared to something like Mad Men, where I feel like in its 4th season, it sort of had this new energy to it, and it was all about, almost more comedic. It feels like this season has been all about these very slow episodes that are all about this slow building tension. And I think for me, it made the first half of the season feel a little bit, almost directionless, and then in the last few episodes, it's all kind of snapped horribly into play.
Yeah, there was definitely light murmurs of discontent, very light, but of discontent in those first episodes when Hank was bedridden and Jesse was kind of just wandering around and Walt was emasculated. But I think those critics have kind of been silenced because you see where it's all been heading now. I think the biggest sign is even the Skyler and Ted plot line, which is I think a lot of people sometimes have problems with, just paid off so well in the last episode or two.
Yeah, it's moving slower than Mad Men. That's a real accomplishment.
Yeah.
Mad Men, which I love, is not an action-packed thrill ride.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite of Mad Men, because Mad Men was very slow in its earlier seasons, but I don't even know. I don't even know if I would consider it fast-paced now, even Mad Men.
I guess to me, a little bit closer. I guess to me, the 4th season of Mad Men, which it's only worth comparing because it's also on AMC, was, to me a little bit more about now it's all sprightly and fun, and, we're getting into the mid-60s, and, there's, an old lady dying, and they have to hide the corpse, and, by comparison, I feel like Breaking Bad, when it started out, there were all the kind of Coen comparisons, and it felt like it was a little bit more, not necessarily comedic, but there was a light touch to it, and I feel like now we're just in this place where it feels like a Western, You know, I mean, like the standoffs between Walt and Gus just really have this long, like, you know, unbroken take, sort of like majesty to them in a way, which I don't think I could have possibly anticipated in the first season.
Yeah, Coen Brothers and Westerns are the two things I keep going back to, too. Coen Brothers with kind of like goofy criminals getting in over their head, like they have a plan and then it goes wrong.
And just the setting and the palette of
Absolutely,
it feels exactly like a Coen Brothers movie.
And then there was a scene earlier in the season where Walt goes, I don't even remember the exact context, but he goes to the Los Pollos Hermanos, and he's sitting there, and it's just this long scene of quiet where he's looking around, his eyes are darting around, he's looking at the camera, he's looking at him, and it reminded me of that first scene in Once Upon a Time in the West, where it's a very Western, very patient, it's just people looking.
Mm-hmm.
Right, more so, I think, than possibly any other show. Breaking Bad is artistic, to use like a very broad term, but I always thought one thing I miss about from the earlier seasons is how they would often the pre-roll to the credits to the opening logo. They used to have a lot of fun with that. I thought it was very cool. Like it was kind of the first TV series to take. Oh, this is something that only TV shows have. What's a creative way to use that rather than just set up the plot for that week's episode? And so they had really cool episodes, like really cool pre-rolls. There was like one that was just a Los Pollos Hermanos commercial. One was that Mexican narco rap about Heisenberg, and then of course
there was the mariachi band at a Heisenberg song.
Yeah, totally. And
but they almost got a little too creative with those in the second season, where there were those really abstract ones where it was just a pool and it was in black and white. And then I guess we're gonna start getting into spoilers. No one's listening to this if they haven't watched the second season Breaking Bad.
Sure.
They all pay off where the episodes that opened with that abstract shot of the teddy bear in the pool, all of the episode titles, like the first word of them all combined to spell out what happened in the finale. And, you know, that's new, but
yeah,
that's pushing it a little too hard for me.
It wasn't like ABQ down over, or no, like 415 down over.
That's
ABQ.
a little too Riddler for me.
Yeah, I did not know about that, the letter code thing, but I actually liked those endings, even the weirder ones when with the teddy bear floating in the pool and you see how it all plays out.
Yeah, I don't mean to complain about it because
even a lot of people had problems with it. I think I
guess I didn't love it, but the reason I watch a show like Breaking Bad is because they do things that no other TV show does. So it's really, I want them to be trying new things, and I want all TV shows and all entertainment to be trying new things that have been tried. Obviously, sometimes that's not going to work out, but when it does, and Vince Gilligan and his crew, it usually does, it's really exciting.
I think it's also the fun thing about Breaking Bad that you brought up, Pat, is that, I think we're all saying, like, this is a great show, and, it's hard for me to really even think about comparing it to any other show on TV now. But I do think that it has changed so drastically much from what it used to be. I think... going off your point, to me, the big difference this season was it didn't feel like they were trying as much to make those little individual episodes that stuck out, sort of out of the pack.
Well, I think they just don't. They just can't now. Things are ratcheted so tight. Although the box cutter, the premiere of this season, was certainly that's. It's probably just the highest moment of tension from the whole season of a whole summer of waiting.
Like 13 minutes of just total silence as Gus is walking over.
Yeah, just watching Gus dress and get undressed. What other show? I don't know if we have yet. That we are recording this. There's 13 episodes. I think 12 of the 13 have aired. We all have not seen the finale.
Right. So if you have not seen the finale, you're safe
like
watching
us.
This. Yeah, and I think I think later we'll have some fun, maybe speculating on what exactly is going to happen.
What kind of horrible events are going to happen in the season finale?
But it's so weird when it's tense because just as a TV viewer, that they're not going to kill Walt. They could maybe kill Jesse, and they're pretty late in the series. Maybe you could kill Skyler. That'd be a huge, huge deal if they did it. They could play that card. But obviously, as a TV viewer, we all know that Bryan Cranston's going to be on the final season of the show, and that his life isn't really in mortal danger, but that I think the show's so good that it's still, you turn that part of your brain off and you're still on the edge of your seat.
Yeah, that kind of brings up another thing I wanted to talk about. Vince Gilligan has said many times in many interviews and that the whole plan for the show is to take this guy and this good man and then turn him into a villain by the end of this series. Do you guys feel like Walter is a villain at this point? Do you think is he redeemable, or is he already evil?
I actually, this is why like the show to me is so compelling, and why I do love Sopranos, and I think that show before this one had the best sort of overall sweep as far as really like staying true to its core philosophy throughout. But I think if there's one thing Breaking Bad has over Sopranos, it's that with Tony there was always kind of this remove from the fact that he was evil, and it was really only I think in the last season of the show, which a lot of people don't like, that you really just saw Tony kind of become this kind of monstrous person. I think the nice thing with Walt has been that I would say starting at the end of the second season, when there was the whole thing where he saw Jesse's girlfriend, die and didn't do anything about it. Like, he's always been sort of irredeemable, and yet you still kind of find yourself cheering for him in a way. I mean, like, as bad as he is, and I think there's some indication that he may still be doing like worse things to come. Like,
yeah,
you still feel like scared for him when his life is threatened or when his family's life is threatened.
Tony Soprano is a really interesting comparison, and I never thought about that because Tony Soprano, even though he's probably a little eviler, Walt had better intentions when he got into. Obviously, they've gotten out of control. But when he got into it, he was dying. It was to feed his family, and his motivations were much more understandable. But I feel like he's a lot less glamorized than Tony Soprano, who's more of a traditional gangster who's in it to get rich. And that's an interesting comparison. I do think he is a villain. Like, in these last few episodes, things have gotten so out of control for him. You're kind of rooting for him to pull off something crazy. But before that on this season, your sympathy is definitely with other characters. I mean, it almost sometimes feels like Jesse is the hero of the show now, which is that's a really hard trick to play off, and I think a really interesting one where they shift your loyalty and your.
Well, and I think it's a funny. I think that's a great point, because this season especially, I really feel like Walters just seems so pitiful in a way.
Absolutely.
And there was that one scene where he was just saying like, "Oh, Jesse, it's all about me. Don't you get it?" Like,
yeah.
And really, I think that you're right that at this point, Jesse, kind of by virtue of the fact that Jesse doesn't want to kill anyone. Like he doesn't want to kill Gus, but he also tells Gus like, "Don't kill Walt," even though Walt spent like the last couple episodes like fighting him and just generally being awful to him. I mean, it feels like he's sort of like the wounded heart that wants to be better than all the men around him.
It feels like the reverse of the last few episodes of last season, when Jesse was kind of the one who was going off the chain, and Gus was kind of planning on maybe taking out Jesse, and Walt had to sort of come to the rescue. And now that's been totally inverted. But I completely agree with what you said about Walt being so emasculated this season, which is pretty ballsy to take your protagonist and just make him this like really kind of pathetic.
Well, I mean, his face is just bruised. I mean, God, like how many fights has he lost?
Right, which is usually Jesse's MO. Jesse's usually the one that gets the crap kicked out of him.
That's a good point. Yeah, because it used to be like
Hank and stuff, and.
It kind of goes back to what you were saying, I think the first question you asked, which was just about how the show has changed a lot over the years, and I think that's probably what that show has done, maybe as well as any other show, with the possible exception, I've got to bring it up, of Lost, which reinvented itself all the time. But breaking, if you look at something like, the show could have gone on forever. It's changed so much from its original premise, where it's like, oh, he's got to hide this second life from his wife. Now she's a part of it, and that's become really interesting. If they were still kind of stuck in that gear where he was still leading this double life, and it was kind of just like they started off in the first season, it gets kind of like Dexter, where you're like, how is this sister seriously not figured out?
How are Walt and Jesse going to get out of this one?
Yeah. Even with the very few amount of episodes they've done, because that first season's only like 6 or 7 episodes, so it's, even though this is the end of the fourth season, it's really like 3.5. It's changed itself so many times, and it's just changed the premise and what the show's about. And I think that's why, it's probably one of the best shows of all time.
Yeah, I think at this point, certainly, going into the last season, I think the last season is always hard for any show, and there's plenty of great shows like The Wire or Lost, where, not to say they had bad last seasons, but they didn't really stick the landing.
Yeah, I'd say even the most hardcore Wire fan will tell you that the last season of The Wire, no one thinks the last season of The Wire isn't the worst one.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of reasons for that, but I think certainly given like how awesome the fourth season of The Wire was, you were primed for something a little bit different.
I like the fifth season of The Wire, and I particularly like the ending of this. I think the fact that they wrapped it up at all is incredible, and I like the ending of the show. But I think it's generally agreed that the 5th season of The Wire is the worst one. I would say Lost had worse seasons than the last one, though, even though the last one's probably not one of the best.
I think really what we're getting at is like there are no shows that have good seasons. I mean, that have good last seasons. I mean, even like Sopranos, which I really like. I think they almost got away with it by David Chase doing his guess what? It's not the last season. It's just gonna keep going forever.
Battlestar too. That's a great question. What's a show that's like really stuck it out and had a great last season? And there's things like Deadwood. Even the last season of Deadwood, it gets a little iffy with that theater troupe. But that I don't even know if you should count that because it was canceled.
I like The Sopranos. I mean, if you're talking about I like the last season of The Sopranos. And I think generally people really enjoy the last season of The Sopranos. That very specific last scene people have, but that's, the last scene is not the same as how the show ends as a whole. I mean, I actually loved the last season, and I particularly loved that last episode.
And the last season is great, but at the same time, it's that kind of extra long season, and there's these weird little detours along the way, like with Vito. Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting, but I mean, it's almost more interesting to look at a show like Battlestar, I think, where that was a season where they were very conscious going into it. This is the end of the show, and we will tell this definitive ending. And
the Battlestar has it's a science fiction show like Lost. It kind of has the same problem in that early on they set up this grand mystery and these prophecies and stuff that they eventually had to pay off. And that's the cool thing about The Sopranos and the really cool thing about Breaking Bad is like you just have we have no idea where it's going to go. I talked to my roommates for an hour. We cannot fathom what the next season is going to be.
That's a great point.
That almost sounds like a negative thing, but I don't mean it that way.
It's very exciting. I mean, it does feel to me like if Gus died in this last episode of the season, then that would change everything. But it wouldn't necessarily surprise me. Like I wouldn't be like, oh well, the show's totally finished now.
Like, well, so let's talk about these last few episodes. I think we've been talking about the show as a whole and maybe the season as a whole, but I feel like these last, certainly I think the last, not the previous episode, but the one before that, which I believe was called Crawl Space, was certainly possibly the best episode of the season. The last 10 minutes of it definitely brought it to a new level.
A lot of people said that the day after the episode aired. I remember talking to you about this.
This is, of course, the episode where a lot happened.
Beneke.
Ted died.
Poor Ted Beneke.
Yeah. Ted broke his neck and died, I think.
Walt tried to, he tried to get a new identity, only to learn that Skylar had given the money to Ted.
So now basically Walt's entire family is dead. And it had this amazing last shot of Walt crying and laughing hysterically.
I love that Bryan Cranston or like whoever was involved in that chose to make him just laugh like this horrible like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest laughter.
I was a little bummed when they did it in this last episode when Jesse's on top of him because I thought it really lessened the impact of that original laugh.
That's a great point. I thought they were on. That not to take anything away from that scene in the crawl space, which is obviously incredible, and like as soon as it ends, you're like, no, I need more, which is kind of the ultimate compliment for a TV show. Like, how soon can I get the next episode? But they had been on a roll of endings even before that one. There's, I think the week before that was the one where Walt and Jesse had gotten in that fight. That was amazing. There was the week before that was the one where Gus destroyed an entire cartel. The week before that was the fight between Walt and Jesse. The week before that, I think, was the flashback, which I enjoyed that scene. I think a lot of people did too, the flashback to kind of the origins of Gus and his relationship with the cartel. So they had really been on a roll. I think all those were, all time. Like I could make a case for any of those being like a high watermark for television, and they've really been on a roll with it.
And very different. They're all good in very different ways. I mean, that Crawl Space had this incredibly tense ending, and it's a very just cliffhanger type ending. Whereas last week's episode just had this great equally good scene, but very different of Gus heading to the car where Walt has presumably hidden a bomb. And it just seems to go on forever.
I do worry a little bit that Gus has gotten he's almost like a monster now. Like it was like when he's like scanning, he sees his car, somehow thinks maybe I shouldn't go there, like using his spider sense. And then he's just straight up like, it's like a monster movie because he's just looking out and slowly scanning for something. And he's almost more than human at this point.
That is something that I think is really interesting. That I'm actually weirded out that more people aren't talking about after that episode, because I think that up to this point, I think the way they've slowly built up Gus is actually really incredible. I mean, if you remember the first time you saw him, it wasn't even really clear that he was going to be a long running character.
Yeah,
there was just the one scene where where Walt was waiting for him in Pollos Hermanos, and you see him and he seems like he's just a clerk.
Yeah.
And at this point, I think especially in that flashback episode, to me, not to always compare things to Lost, but to me that was sort of like the man behind the curtain episode, which is here is a villain who's already so interesting. And typically speaking, with villains, when you learn about their backstory, it lessens them. That didn't do it. It made him more interesting and more compelling, and I think even a little bit more mysterious in a way.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, and revelations. And there's still they alluded to even a deeper past somewhere. I can't remember what country it was in.
In Chile, I think, right?
Yeah. Well, which is very. And I think
there's still a piece of it.
Yeah.
I'm getting my wires crossed with Sons of Anarchy, which is also having Chilean rebels in a drug cartel right now. But I think there is another layer.
It's the new TV cliche.
Yeah,
there's Chilean rebels.
But there is more of. I think there's potentially more of surprises and things to learn in Gus's backstory. It's interesting you compare it to Lost. Again, not to keep talking about Lost. But when you were talking about how when he first appears, I kind of want to go back. I don't remember. It was so gradual, a lot like Ben, where he showed up and you didn't think it was a big deal, and before you know it, he's one of the best parts of the show. And Ben, I think, was probably the best part of Lost in that last year.
I believe his first appearance is very inauspicious. He's Rousseau caught him in his net, and he's just a very pathetic character.
And I know that in the case of Lost, they hired him, and then they saw how good he was, and then they made him a larger part of the show because he was incredible. But do you have any idea, either of you, do you know if that was the case with Breaking Bad, where they just hired, what's his name? I can't remember the actor's name now. I don't know who he is.
Giancarlo Esposito.
Yeah, he's going to be getting a lot more work after this year of that show. And do you think they hired him, and then they saw how good he was, and they were like, okay, this is a major part of things now?
I do think something very similar happened. It's always interesting to read about how Vince Gilligan and his crew put the show together, because, I think considering, just how effectively I think they moved the story forward, it does feel as if they don't necessarily have such a rigid plan in place that they can't do things like that. And I do think that they kind of just brought him in at the end of the second season, thought he was awesome. He may have been added as a regular in the third season, and I just feel like, I think after that season they just saw they could do anything with him. So now it's just now he's this primal monster who's able to smell bombs and turn his X-ray vision out to Albuquerque.
That's what's kind of cool about making a TV show is you got to recognize, I think that both Damon Lindelof and Carlton Cuse and here Vince Gilligan saw this guy, and even though he wasn't part of the original plan, they both recognized, and I don't know, maybe Vince Gilligan wasn't part of his original plan, I'm not totally sure, but they both recognized the potential and said, okay, well, we can change our plan and make it better. And, you have to have a plan, but it's also about thinking on your feet.
And Breaking Bad kind of struggled to find a long-term villain. I recently kind of went back, just trying to catch up on, because so much has happened in these 4 seasons. I was just trying to remember, remember Crazy 8? He was the first guy.
And there was a year break between 3 and 4, and there was the writer's strike between 1 and 2. So I watched season 1 of this show, I don't know, 4 years ago already, and I only watched them once. So
so there really wasn't any good long-term. I mean, Crazy 8 had maybe 3 episodes, and then Tuco is probably the last long-term villain, and then of course the 2 cousins, but they weren't arch nemesis the way Gus is. They were just kind of hired goons almost.
No, Gus is clearly the Ben Linus of the show.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and what I like too is how I think it was sort of you kind of saw this a little bit with Tuco, but it really sort of happened slowly in the second season, and then really came to the fore with the cousins in the third season, where you kind of always had the cartel as this really just demonic presence that whenever anything happened with them, it was just horrifying.
Yeah.
It was always down in Mexico, and I think it's great that having built that up so much, then you finally met the head of the cartel, played by the guy from Scarface, and then Gus killed them all. It was just well, there you go. He is the ultimate badass now. I mean, it was a great way to just, I think, slowly build up this one character who didn't initially seem that villainous as someone who was just kind of all powerful.
And he's also he's sort of the ideal of what I think Walt and even Skyler, to a certain extent, imagined their drug careers being like. It's very careful, very methodical, kind of bulletproof, but he's also, but you see the consequences of that is that he's a monster. He has to cut people's throats open with a box cutter and, you know, kill children. So it kind of shows you that, like, there's really no... I mean, maybe to change gears to Skylar here, I think... And I've never been a huge Skylar fan, but she really won me over this season.
Yeah, they made Skylar a lot more... I mean, well...
I mean,
they brought her into the story, you know? Like, before she was just like...
She has blood on her hands. I mean, Ted's blood is on her hands now.
Yeah.
She's, like, partially responsible for his death.
I mean, I think that Skylar got... In this, I think January Jones and Betty Draper kind of gets an unfair rap, too, where the character is supposed to be grading, and, you know, they're, like, stopping the protagonist from achieve... You know, they're holding them back a little bit, because that's their characters. And I think people often are like, I hate January Jones, I hate Betty Draper. I think a lot of people were, like, mad at Skylar because she was mad at Walt, but, you know, Walt's wife should be mad at Walt.
Well, I didn't like her because I thought she was a little hypocritical. But I think maybe that was the point, and that's kind of paid off. Now,
definitely.
You know, what are your thoughts on
I do think, Jeff, that you're totally right, that there was always this quality to her of, like, okay, she's, like, the don't have fun, like, kind of nagging part of the show, you know? Like, Walt, like, you know, why aren't you here for me giving birth? And, like, basic things like that. And I think that the great thing is, by bringing her into the fold, I think on one hand, she sort of really gives Walt this pretty stark impression of just what an awful human being he's become. At the same time, I think it's definitely been interesting seeing how, I mean, even last season when she was lying for Ted Beneke, and it's like, well, I guess that's an okay lie because it's like, you know, it's.
But then now it's snowballed.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's great because it started off as this kind of white collar lie, and then like she brought in, what's the lawyer's name, Saul, and it really, I mean, there's this interesting quality to how I think she started off as this sort of angelic, like, you know, I'm, you know, the vision of good figure, and that's not how it is anymore.
I never would have thought like Ted would have play such a strong part in the show and have such an amazing scene. I really thought he was just this. I thought he was just there to provide some kind of motivation for Walt to get angry in season 3. But you know, he had such a great exit for Ted.
Do you think how tightly? I get the impression just from the little bit I've read that they're sort of making it up as they go along. I don't mean that as a criticism. I think a lot of people use that exact phrase as a criticism of Lost or Battlestar, because those are shows where they were like, there's 13, you know, they laid out these specific riddles, but I think they're making it up as they go along, and it's really impressive, it's really impressive the way they've, like, taken little things like Skylar lying for him or the car wash and kind of made them, you know, pay off and make them big things.
The ricin, like that ricin is like.
Well, by the way, what do you guys actually think about the ricin? I mean, like this is us having seen episode 12 going into the finale. I mean,
this is the ricin that was used to poison. I can't remember the kid's name, but
Jesse's girlfriend's kids.
I think that maybe it's going to be a situation where, and this is what I thought initially happened, where. I guess it's pretty clear Walt didn't do it, right? I think maybe he did. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, like,
a lot of people that I've talked to in the last 24 hours, but are kind of there's a lot of like confusion about like the ricin. I think I'm not really sure. I think people feel like it's maybe not the best written sort of twist because does seem to be holes in it. Like when did they get the cigarette out? You know, and. I think it's at its face value. I think Walt nailed it. I think that's probably what happened.
You think Walt did it?
No. I think Walt. Okay. I think what Walt said to Walt's whole explanation about how Gus did it.
I think the other option is that maybe maybe the kid. How old is the kid? Because the kid's not a major character.
Like 8 years old or 9 years old.
Maybe the kid found the cigarette and kind of like it'll be a thing for Jesse where he feels guilty because it will be his fault. Like the kid will have found the cigarette in his pocket.
Totally, Jesse's like, you know.
Well, I'll give you my pitch on why I think Walt did it. It's partially because I kind of feel like each of the full seasons, so like not counting season 1, which was shortened by the writer's strike, but season 2 and season 3, their sort of like final acts all kind of revolved around Walt taking this extra sort of like next step.
Sure.
You know, killing someone who wasn't innocent, first Jesse's girlfriend, then Gail, or you know, the girlfriend, not so much killing as letting her die.
And also in terms of like, I want to hear what you have to say, but like, there's I'm kind of to a certain extent a Walt apologist because Gail was also guilty. Gail was cooking meth as well. Like Gail's not a good person. Yeah, he was playing the drug game. Jesse's girlfriend, a little more innocent, though she was blackmailing him. But you know,
he does keep getting lower and lower.
I guess to me, like, what this comes down to is, I mean, like, the twist does feel kind of awkward. I mean, I think the fact that he was carrying around the cigarette for a season kind of like carries it for me.
It is a little anticlimactic with how much
there was something so strange about the whole scene where Walter was like, Jesse, don't you see? Like, this is how it all happened. Like, Gus did it. Like, it felt forced in a way that, like, I think the writers may have intended.
That's
and like,
interesting.
I'd be really intrigued to see if this was sort of Walt's like last ditch plan to save himself, which I think would add a lot to the show. I mean, it could just be that Gus did it, but it doesn't feel to me like Gus would take that kind of step.
Oh, so you're saying that Walt poisoned the kid, and in order to convince Jesse that it was Gus,
exactly,
so Jesse kills Gus.
Sort of the old like double triple cross around.
I can see that. I mean, it would certainly like that would make Walt completely evil. he would be pure evil.
Yeah. He's getting there. It's certainly within the realm of possible. Like, but it would be believable if that happened. It's amazing how gradual. Like, if you go back and watch that, and this is so much credit to Bryan Cranston. If you just watch that first episode and the most recent episode, you would never believe that they got there, but they really turn the heat up slowly, and it never seemed jarring. Like it's been so gradual, and that's so great.
I mean, it's really kind of incredible. I mean, to kind of go off of what I think you were saying earlier, Pat, just about how how the writers have been sort of like able to make these changes. I think it just shows that when you're working with an actor like that, where they can just do anything at all. I was thinking about this because I just recently did sort of like a big run through of the entire run of Fringe, and how like there's a point in that show where they suddenly figure out that with Anna Torv they can have her do anything and play her character in a million different ways, and it makes it that much more interesting. I think
that must have been after I stopped watching Fringe.
Fringe
they were making things more interesting.
Fringe gets really, really good around the third season. I can't possibly recommend it because then you have to watch all of the first two seasons, but it's worth watching someday if you're ever sick with a terrible
television
flu.
Is the only medium where it's like you got to watch the first. You have to watch dozens of hours before it gets good. Like no one's ever like the last 20 pages of Great Expectations are good. But you have to get through 1,000 pages of crap.
Yeah, it's weird. Sometimes it takes a show. I mean, Breaking Bad did not come out of the gate running. Like that first season of Breaking Bad's good, but it's not the best show ever. Whereas now you could make I think a pretty strong case that it's one of the best shows ever. If not,
and it really,
I think it's certainly up there. I mean, like top 5. I can't think of anything else where like and the fact that it has made I think the fewest wrong moves after that initial sort of like sprint is really kind of like one of the most interesting things about the show.
And then just on so many other levels, like we said before, it's very artistic. It's very, it has its own. It's also a nice cross between a sort of nice psychological show, but then it's also kind of a genre show because there's guys running around with guns and stuff.
And it's funny too.
Yeah,
it's not there are
less so now than.
Yeah, it's not as Saul's still funny and Walt's reactions are still funny. I thought this was cool that they had Bill Burr as one of the thugs last week. And, it was very serious what he was doing. He was being threatening, but I think they hired a comedian for a reason because he was being threatening in a funny way.
He was great. Yeah, well, and like they also had him earlier in the season when Skyler needed a guy to pretend to be from like the health council or whatever. Yeah, he was great. Yeah,
I didn't realize that was him at the time.
A lot of awesome little bit parts in Breaking Bad that I think really kind of add up over time.
What was I gonna say?
I'm really worried about Saul. I'd be really sad if Saul died.
Oh, that would be.
I don't think Saul
that would
would
be
die.
a tragedy.
I think that is when he was preparing to run away yesterday. I was just. I think that might be what would make me the saddest on the show. If I thought Saul.
Well, I mean, it is funny. I kind of feel like with some shows that do that get I think a lot of their tension from the fact that they kill off characters. It's interesting to see how when they kill off a certain character, even if they're not the most essential, the show takes it like a downhill slide afterwards. Like I'm kind of on board with saying that a show like Lost, once they killed off the original John Locke, I think it never fully recovered.
Sure,
I'd agree with that.
Like 24 killed off Curtis, who was just kind of like this awesome dude who always helped out Jack, and then after he died, it went downhill. I think Saul. I think if he were gone, like there would be no hope left in Breaking Bad.
I think Saul is kind. Saul is kind of like the I think Lapidus sort of who came into Lost.
I'm glad we're mapping all of the Breaking
I know.
Lost characters.
I should say. I mean, I think objectively, Breaking Bad's a better show than Lost, and I like Lost. But
I think it's certainly a higher quality show. Lost holds a really special place a really unique and special place in my heart. I'm talking about like it's like
I agree. I think I feel the same way. But
anyway, Junior is Hurley.
When Saul kind of makes his appearances, actually to map another character, because this one I feel strongly about. Gale is kind of like the Leslie Arts of this season, because he's like, he's a character who was killed off.
He keeps on coming back.
But he comes back, and it's really fun. He sort of like haunted this episode in a very cool way. You know, he had that flashback in the first scene, and then like we had a great reaction when I think it might have been the third or fourth episode of this season when Hank plays the karaoke video, and it's just kind of like you're singing
Major Tom, I think.
Major Tom in some like Thai karaoke bar or something, and it was very.
I always thought that they never something I thought was really interesting and never really addressed is that Gale. There was a scene I think from the season finale of last year, if not from the season finale, from the penultimate episode, where Gus goes up to Gale and he's like, "Can you do this? You may need to be doing it soon." And it seemed like Gus was telling Gale, "I'm going to kill Walt," and Gale was saying, agreeing with that. And everyone treats Gale like he was like this fawn that got caught up in everything.
Sure.
But I read that scene as he was implicitly allowing the murder and standing by and like he knew what he was mixed up in.
And in a broader sense,
it's true. I mean, he was cooking meth for a horrible criminal enterprise. I mean, like he is not the most innocent man of all time.
I mean, I think you had pointed this out. This is along this end of season 2, I guess. But with the plane crash, that's kind of like a metaphor for like what they're doing. They're seemingly. They kind of feel like they're all just like, I'm only hurting people who are directly threatening me. I'm only hurting Jesse's girlfriend because she's blackmailing me, and she's also, she's hurting Jesse, who's addicted to heroin and stuff. But then we see the consequences of that are a plane crash that kills 100 innocent people. And you got to remember, like every day they're going in and like making a drug that that people die over, and that
that's the funny thing is, like they're making this horribly addictive drug that like I mean, it's always interesting. I feel like they haven't done it as much in later seasons, but they used to have those episodes where you'd meet those horrible meth heads. Remember
Wendy.
there's one episode where
with the ATM machine.
Yes, with the ATM machine, and just this old
episode.
crone. I mean, like I don't know where they found that actress, but she was just incredible, and like I think that
I remember that.
I mean, in a sense, maybe it's to kind of like reflect how Walter is kind of getting more and more like trying to like become less concerned about like the ethical side of that, but like you do kind of forget that like they're making one of the worst drugs like on the market,
And in that episode, Jesse, there's a kid there that Jesse's like very kind of tender to. Jesse is definitely one of the most. I mean, I don't want to use the word moral because moral is such a loaded word when you're talking about the show, but he definitely seems to be certainly the most sensitive character, I would say. He cries more than anyone else, whereas Walter, the scary thing about Walter is he's so good at justifying what he does. That episode, the premiere of this season, there's a whole speech he has when he's talking to Gustavo, as Gustavo's like preparing to, putting on his clean suit and stuff, and he's just saying like, I didn't want to kill Gale, but you forced me to do this, and this
is on your hands.
Yeah,
blood is on your hand.
He uses all that like scientific high school teacher logic to just make himself feel good for killing people.
It's true. Well, I mean, I guess that's always been the most interesting thing, and I think this is kind of common knowledge that Jesse, the original plan was to kill him off in the first season.
I didn't know that.
I mean,
Me neither.
That was kind of their working plan, and talking about like really just changing things up a little bit to adjust to actors.
It's so hard to imagine.
It's hard to imagine the show without him now, and it almost seems like you thought that he was going to be the character who would be sort of like corrupting Walt, and the opposite is very
Definitely.
often true. And if anything, that's been the weird thing this season is that you could argue that he's kind of been corrupted in some ways. I mean, like he's gotten more involved in the drug trade, and he is killing more people. But even so, like he still seems to be. There's still something more trustworthy about him, I would say, than about Walt. I mean, and maybe it is just he doesn't try to justify himself.
Well, a lot of times his violence is. It's more of like I want to get like right now he wants to kill Gus for vengeance for poisoning this kid or presumably poisoning this child, and then last season it was the same thing. It's sort of he's kind of got like a moral code that other characters don't have. But I think I just want to switch gears to which we're kind of already talking about. But what do you guys think is going to happen in next week's episode? Darren, I think you kind of gave me chills with your prediction because it does seem. It fits very well in a lot of ways, and
it's very interesting.
It's sort of Walt being the one who actually poisoned the kid. It kind of makes sense. It makes sense for like Vince Gilligan's grand scheme because that would unquestionably make Walt the villain. The only like moral justification is that
Careful.
Gus, for poisoning a child is, well, Gus threatened his baby and his son and his wife. So I think in Walt's brain, that is enough to get him to do something that extreme. But I do want to stress that it would make him a bad person. And then it is
interesting though, like to actually question what will happen. I mean, it does feel like this whole season we've really been primed for, what feels like the ultimate showdown, Western style, between Walt and Gus. And even the way that they've kind of passed Jesse back and forth, it's kind of like, well, he's my pawn, no, he's my pawn.
Yeah.
Like it feels like there has to be a reckoning there. At the same time, what does that mean for a TV show that still has one more season to go? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine them killing off, as Jeff was saying, like Gus or Walt or Jesse. But I wouldn't be surprised if someone from Walt's family bites
I think
the
you
dust.
could kill Gus. I think in order of expendability, it probably goes Gus, Walt's family, Jesse, Walt.
Mm-hmm. And if Walt turns out to be a more evil person than we think, like if he crosses that line, he takes the place of Gus. He becomes as interesting a character as Gus is.
It does seem like since the beginning of the season, they've been setting up just been moving in this direction where Walt takes over Gus's empire one way or the other. I don't know. I can't even imagine how we get to that point, but it just feels like, the next step in Walt's rise to power.
Mm-hmm. What about Walt's family? Do you think they're in danger next episode?
I mean, how would you guys feel if Walter Jr. were to die?
I've actually thought about that.
Indifferent.
I think that I could see an end game for the show. I couldn't see him pulling this card yet, but I could see an end game of the show where Walt, through action or through inaction, somehow, sacrifices a member of his family or is forced to choose between, like, his lifestyle and giving up all that he's got, like, this new position that he may or may not have, or his family in choosing the position. I think that'd be a really interesting way for
that
it to go.
Yeah, that would be the escalation at the end of next season.
Yeah,
right.
If depending on what choices he makes at next week and what choices he's made this season, like, how much that's the question everyone asks. How much lower can Walt go?
And he would justify, well, listen, I still have the other kids, so I mean, as far as the moral balance goes, I mean, it's interesting because, I do always find the Walt's family subplots kind of compelling, like, even stuff with his sister-in-law, I mean, and her very occasional sort of weird bouts of kleptomania are intriguing. At the same time, I mean, I almost kind of feel like, to bring up a different comparison, if this were The Sopranos, I think Walter Jr. is kind of the Meadow character, where like it's sort of interesting to have her around, but she never really necessarily drives the plot in any kind of meaningful way.
That's interesting.
I mean, even compared to in later seasons, some people hate AJ with a burning passion, but like they really tried in that last season, and I always found this compelling to really like graft like the struggles of his father onto him.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like they're that interested in doing that with Walter Jr. I mean, like
that kid was terrific, and I mean, he doesn't have a lot to do on the show often. I think there's like a running joke where all he ever does is eat breakfast with the family. But there was a scene an episode ago where he visited Walt after Walt hadn't left the house for a day or two, and he was all beat up. And it was like a capital A acting scene for Bryan Cranston, and the kid who plays Walt Jr. was terrific in it. He really stepped up to the plate.
Mm-hmm. The problem with that character, and I think the actor's really good, and the character has his virtues and stuff, but he's so in the dark now. He's like he's more in the dark than any other character, more than Skylar ever was, and so he's constantly like yelling at the wrong person for the wrong scene. He's always like, "Mom, what's wrong with you? You gotta get Dad," or like, "Uncle Hank, what's wrong with you?" I'm like, you're so clueless, kid.
Yeah, it seems like what I'm really interested to see before the end of the show is that inevitable scene where Hank or Junior, where either one of them, learns who Walt really is and confronts him about it. It seems like that scene has to happen because, like, we're just moving in that direction, and that's a show that's like that's a hard thing to do, and it's a game changer. But that's a show that's changed the game.
You're right, and even the way that I feel like I haven't watched the original episodes in a while, but it feels like all along Hank has always been on Walt's trail, and I mean we're seeing it more and more now, like with Walt literally driving him around to follow the path of Heisenberg. But I mean, it feels like, I mean, I can't even imagine what that scene would play out as. I mean, because doesn't I feel like
that's what makes it so exciting.
Hank kind of thinks that Walter is just this Muppet, right?
Yeah.
I thought that maybe it was like the third or fourth episode this year, and it was the first time Walt had gotten up and the police report had reinvigorated him, And there's that scene in the bedroom where he's like, WM, WW. Who do you think that is? WW. What do you think? And like, I thought that it was potentially like he was on to Walt and he was kind of mocking him, though they've made it pretty clear since that was not the case.
What do you think is in store for whatever happens next week? You know, season 5. What is that season going to be?
I mean, so I think from what I understand, they've established that after much back and forth with AMC, it's going to be a 16-episode final season, and I think the plan would be to do sort of similar to what happened with Sopranos. You kind of split it in half and have 8 episodes. Probably.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I mean, like
I think that is what they're doing.
Like, given how long the delays have been, probably 8 episodes at the end of next year, and then 8 more in 2013. So
but I think the delays have been because of contract stuff, which is now all covered. So hopefully they can get them out.
Could be happening
It'll be less
sooner.
time than it was between season
but
3 and 4.
So 2 mini seasons, so to speak.
I mean, like I think that's sort of what's been established. I mean,
that's
I would
correct.
imagine it's going to be more like one big season with kind of an interesting break right in the middle.
Kind of like what Doctor Who did this summer.
Exactly,
Or
yeah.
Battlestar,
So,
I think, as well.
yeah,
Battlestar
Battlestar definitely
did
did that too with a really memorable mid-season
But I mean,
finales.
narratively, you know, where's it going to be set? Are we going to find out about Gus's background in Chile?
I don't know, but it's gonna be great because these things we're saying were like, it feels like Walt could die even though we know he's not gonna die. He could die next year, you know? Like all these characters, once you get to the end, anything could happen. That's a show where almost anything could happen right now. So once there's very few episodes left, anything can happen. I think it's gonna be. I mean, I can't wait to.
It does feel to me like Jeff, what you were saying earlier about how this is a show where I think they constantly try to kind of move the medium forward. It does feel to me like this is totally a show where they might kill off the lead character with like 4 episodes left.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
then just kind of like see what plays out in his wake. I mean, it's exciting to think about. Just what
If they
might
make
do.
him evil enough, though, if they really follow through with that, and I gotta give him credit. I mean, I really thought whenever he said that, I'm like, Vince Gilligan's just saying that, and he means evil, like TV evil, which is like kind of maybe a noble crook, but it seems like he's getting less and less redeemable. But
To answer to get back to your original question, though, I only kind of skirted it because I really have no idea where it'll be set, and I guess we'll know more after next week, but maybe we won't. After the 3rd season ended with that great scene where Jesse shoots Gale, I had no idea where the 4th season would go. And it's kind of cool. This is something Gabrus brought up when we talked about Game of Thrones. I think Breaking Bad does this really well, too, where they do cliffhangers where it's not like, there's about to be a knife fight, and then we cut away. The knife fight happens, and then the cliffhanger is, what are the implications of this knife fight going to be? Rather than, like, who is going to, rather than having, like, the car flying over the cliff and to be continued. You actually see the exciting event happen, and then you have to speculate about what's going to happen.
I think that's such a good point. Well, and that's why, like, on one hand, each season feels like an awesome ending unto itself, and so, it's not something simplistic, like, oh, who died? It's more kind of like, well, where do they go from here? And I think that's a question that we ask. I mean, almost every week with this show, in a way.
So that 3rd season ended with Jesse shooting Gale, and then which puts Gus in this place where, even though he was about to kill Walt, if not both of them, he now needs them. And as soon as it ended, I was like, I cannot wait to see that first confrontation between between Gus and Walt. And because of production delays and contracts or whatever, it took a year plus to get there. But then when it happened, it was that scene that we've already talked about where you just watch Gus like dress and undress.
Yeah.
And it did, even with a year of hype, it was nothing like what I expected, and it did not disappoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's that rare example of a show where it feels like it could go anywhere. I mean, what you were talking about with Walt taking over Gus's criminal empire.
Yeah.
I mean, we could be looking at it's like the second half of a Grand Theft Auto game where it's just all about like running around and like getting rid of the rest of the dealers. It could be that. It could be it could be something more intimate. I mean, I guess that's the cool thing is that it feels like
I think it's got to be. It's got to be like Walt versus Jesse or something, because at this point, Walt versus any other drug dealer in the world, it's just not going to match up. And they haven't introduced anyone that could be a better villain than Gus. If there was some other character on the periphery who maybe we would see come in, like that's what the cool thing about Gus. You got to introduce him gradually, and they haven't really done that.
Yeah,
so.
I think you're right. Yeah, it does feel like they've reached the outer exterior of how crazily villainous you can be.
Yeah, because I think that if they had this car bomb scene in like the second Gus episode, for whatever reason, like Walt tried to kill him, and then like he just sensed that it was there, and that happened in the first scene, you'd be like, who is this cartoon character?
Yeah.
What is he doing in my show? but because we like saw all this, because they built him up, it was believable, as much as it could be, that this guy was really that, badass, I guess.
I would say that my personal hope for next season, given that it's 16 episodes, is an entire episode told from the perspective of the aging mobster who has spent the entire series in a wheelchair.
Oh, Salamanca.
Yeah, Salamanca, capable only of communicating with a bell.
Yeah.
Like, who thought that guy was gonna still be around like 2 years later?
Oh, you know what? But that guy gave again, talking about people stepping up to the plate. He's usually in the wheelchair ringing the bell, and he's usually good at it. But last week, when Gus came back to kind of rub it in his face, he gave this great performance, which was like a silent thing where he was, it was all in his eyes, where where Gus had like killed everyone he ever loved and destroyed everything that he ever worked for. And
it's the best heavy nose breathing since Tony Soprano. I think.
Yeah, like
it's all in the nose breaths.
Yeah, it was really and it was this character who's he's around and he does just fine, but they asked him to do a little more and he nailed it.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that's kind of it. I think we've talked about. I mean, there's really nothing to do but wait for next week episode.
It's gonna be.
The thing I'm most certain about, the only thing I know for sure about next year is that I'm going to be watching it, and it's going to be incredible. Like you just know you're in good hands,
Yeah, I mean, it feels like just the way, like the world that they've established, and the fact they can be so funny and so scary and so kind of like make you love these characters who do the worst things. I mean, it's hard to compare it to any other show.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Yeah, for sure.
So we keep saying that maybe Breaking Bad's the best show ever. Where do you think it realistically fits in on the list of best shows ever? Is it in that first tier with The Wire and Deadwood? I think it is.
I think it's up there. I mean, for me, the shows that are kind of in that tier, you definitely have Sopranos and The Wire. I'd put in Deadwood and Battlestar Galactica and Lost also. I think the complete sweep of that show was just really...
And Sopranos. Yeah, those are like the
Sopranos. But I guess
to me,
I guess to me, with each one, there are things you can check off that were sort of disappointing. Like Deadwood, I mean, it sucks they never got to really tell like the full stretch of that story.
You can't hold that against the show. But that third season goes a little off the rails.
Right. I mean, as much as I love Brian Cox, that third season he didn't add that much to it. Certainly The Wire we've already talked about, and I think even Sopranos, maybe just because it ran so much longer than Breaking Bad. I think it had a lot of little tangents along the way, and I think with Breaking Bad, I think you just have the longer it gets, the more focused it gets, which is such a rarity.
What I think is cool is it's able to do more with. There's only three. There's really two characters in Breaking Bad. 3 if you count Gus, that you are really completely 100% focused on. I think that's kind of a
The Wire
plus.
had 73.
Yeah, and I think I love The Wire, but I think I almost think of it more as it's a more intelligent show than it is like a great narrative. It's not like great literature with the way Breaking Bad is. And I saw in Wired once they did they had a chart of trying to do The Wire in Wired magazine. They had a sort of grid of all the Breaking Bad kind of who connects with who, and there were arrows connecting to the character. I'm like, you don't really need that for Breaking Bad, and that's almost one of its strengths. It's it's about Walter White,
That is a good point. I mean, I feel like every other show we're talking about, even The Sopranos in a way, I think when I'm talking about tangents there, it's when, they would do stuff with Christopher and stuff with all these other characters and a lot of world building. I think you're right that in a weird way, Breaking Bad has remained so laser focused on just a few key characters. And I mean, I can't think of any other drama that's been quite that.
Narratively, I'd put it up there. I'd put it with The Sopranos. I'd put it above The Wire. I'd put it above Lost.
I think this is what's so cool about TV right now is that if a new album came out or a new band and we were like, this is the best band ever, it's kind of bullshit. They're not really the best. There's so much recorded music. But when you talk about the best show ever, there's really only a few things that are in the running because it's only in the past 15 years now, maybe. Let's say The Sopranos is kind of, there's stuff like Hill Street Blues before it, but...
Basically Sopranos, though,
yeah. Yeah, Sopranos is kind of like the dawn of this golden age of TV that we're living in. So when you say something's the best show ever, I think it's legitimately possible this might be the best television show of all time, and that's very exciting.
Now, the question is, though, guys, going into this last season, let's say the last season is disappointing, and maybe it's even just kind of like a Wire-level disappointment.
Yeah.
Would that change the show for you? I mean, if you think that if it reaches the point where they just can't quite, not say stick the landing, but if they took a horrible detour in this next season, I mean,
it's a great question.
I'm not sure. I mean, it seems so unlikely. I almost don't even want to why bother thinking about the question? It seems impossible that they'll do it. I think it's less important for this show than it is for a show like Battlestar or Lost, where there was a definite point they were moving to. It's like, and for The Sopranos, I'd say it was less important too. You know what I think the show that has the best beginning, middle, and end like arc over as a whole is The Shield. The Shield has a beginning, and then there's a middle with the Armenian buddy train, and then there's an end game where the last 2 seasons, and the ending of that show is incredible.
And those two shows.
I just wanted to talk about The Shield. I forgot why I said that.
Well, no, you're saying. Well, he had asked earlier about. That's a good comparison, though. The Shield and Breaking Bad, I feel like, share a lot of the same themes.
Definitely,
They both have very questionable protagonists. In fact, the sort of Shane Vic Mackey standoff in the last season is sort of very similar to some of the power plays that happened in and just tonally they feel a lot alike. They're both kind of
they both have this element of it which you and I have Pat and I have talked about a lot in the past, where on any given episode, and The Shield is like the king of this, and Sons of Anarchy does it a little too, but on any given episode, like, they are a inopportune sneeze away from having their entire lives destroyed. Like, they're on The Shield and on Breaking Bad, like, they're at any minute just on this razor thin wire where they could just completely go into oblivion on any given episode, and it makes it so tense. And both those shows, I think, maybe, I don't know, I'm just.
But they're both smart to kind of way more in the earlier seasons when Skyler didn't know, and Hank was really. I mean, there's definitely, I think there's a scene both in Breaking Bad and in The Shield where there's literally a thin door between a cop who's Hank's on one side of the door, or Colette's like looking, and then the other side of the door is like Vic Mackey and the rest of them like cleaning up a big pile of cocaine in the corner.
I think that, I mean, I can think of several just off the top of my head from Breaking Bad. There was one this week where the cops were looking around the laundromat and they were like, just knocking on the wrong thing away from discovering the entire drug super lab. There was the one which is so tense and was so great where Hank had Walt and Jesse pinned down in the trailer.
Yep, yeah.
And like, if Hank opens that door, he sees his cousin. I mean,
everything falls apart.
Everything falls apart.
It's actually a good comparison to that to The Shield. I actually think the one show to me that right now has the best chance of one-upping Breaking Bad is also on AMC. And to me, the compelling thing about Mad Men is that of all the shows we're talking about, I think that's the one show where like there's never a threat of death on that show.
Yes,
really.
yeah.
Which I don't want to get on like a moral high horse.
No, I think you're right. It's obvious overlooked that show for so long.
It's funny because I feel like every other show that we're talking about, like Sopranos, there was always like the threat of like anybody could die, like Big Pussy, like The Wire. Certainly, they could kill off half their cast and still have like 30 people left. Like,
I always say Mad Men is like Mad Men's the only show that I feel like is spoiler proof. Like if I hear someone talking about Mad Men, and I've seen I'm completely caught up and everything, but like it's not about the twists. There's the occasional twist about Don's past or about maybe like Sterling Cooper, something crazy happens in one episode, but like it's definitely. Like I think the best episode of the last season. I can't remember the name of the episode. It was the one. It was about the boxing match. With the Don and
the suitcase.
Peggy. The suitcase, right? You can't really there's not really just spoil in that episode. Like if someone's like, oh, you don't tell me like, oh, Don has like Don is sad the whole episode. Like,
I mean,
but
it's like, oh, like Don had an epiphany. Like, no, like you totally ruined it for me, man.
It's definitely it's the only. It's probably of
all these shows we talked about, it's the only one where people are not constantly in mortal danger. Deadwood, The Shield, Lost, Battlestar, especially. The Wire. What else have we talked about? All these shows, because I mean, it makes sense why. Like, it's exciting when people could die at any given moment. And all those shows are shows that were willing to kill off main characters. The Joss Whedon shows too. But Mad Men does stand out as like a show where it manages to be a great show, even though Don's not likely to whack Roger Sterling any episode.
I mean, it feels like the biggest danger is like Pete might lose his job, or like.
And because of that, it can explore things that these other shows are like not able to do.
That's the problem with Mad Men. That's why it sucks so hard.
No, but
think of how much better it would be if Don Draper like carried a gun with him everywhere. And was
there's a Walking Dead crossover episode coming soon. No, but I think it's totally logical because Mad Men's a relatively newer show, and. It takes a while, like with movies, I think probably for like 30 years, all movies were like Western shoot-em-ups, and, it took a while before someone was like, hey, let's make a movie where someone doesn't die, or there's not like cowboys and Indians, where it's just like about being alive. And
romance.
Totally, 6 Feet Under is also, I think, a very good show that is also not about, I mean, it is about death, but
it's not about people killing each other.
Yeah. And I am aware that Breaking Bad is definitely like, a genre show.
Every episode, I'm on the edge of my seat, like literally, like I'm giving a quote for an ad for a movie, but like I'm really like white knuckle, like can't wait to see what happens next.
Yeah, I think that's probably it for now.
I think we've covered this forever.
I'm afraid to learn more.
Entertainment
about the
720.
episode.
Yeah. We'll have to do our post thing when none of our expectations are met by the finale.
Yeah, we just rail on it for a while. Thanks for doing this, guys.
Of course.
Jeff,
Totally.
Darren,
Thanks for having
thank you
us.
for being here. Entertainment Weekly, EW.com.
That's me.
That is you. All right, guys. If you're listening to this, you probably watched Breaking Bad, so enjoy the finale.